The afternoon sun slanted through the high, dusty windows of the old Cleveland playhouse, casting long rectangles of light across scuffed wooden floors. Inside the main rehearsal room, usually echoing with the clatter of set pieces or the warm-up scales of actors, the air felt unusually thick, charged with a kind of nervous energy that only auditions could bring. Dozens of kids milled about, some in crisp dance shoes, others clutching sheet music in folders that looked like they'd been handled with reverence. Parents hovered near the back wall, whispering encouragement or checking their phones with forced calm. Everyone knew this wasn't just any community theater gig. This was the Music Man, a classic, a crowd pleaser, and the director Martin Greaves had a reputation. He didn't do charity cases. He didn't do almost good enough. If you walked into his audition room, you'd better be ready to impress. And then there was the boy. He stood near the door, slightly apart from the others, as if he weren't sure he belonged. His blazer was clearly second-hand, navy blue but faded at the elbows and hanging loosely on his narrow frame like it had been borrowed from someone much older. His shoes, though clean, showed the wear of many miles walked. He carried no folder, no binder, just a small notebook tucked under his arm, its pages curling at the edges. He didn't pace or mutter lines under his breath like the others. He just watched, quiet, eyes darting occasionally toward the upright piano tucked in the far corner of the room, a tired-looking instrument with yellowed keys and a chipped leg. More furniture than instrument at this point. His name was Eli, though no one had asked yet. He hadn't come for a singing part or a dancing role. He'd seen the notice posted at the public library. Seeking pianist for offstage accompaniment. Must read music, improvise, and commit to full rehearsal schedule. That was it. No age limit, no experience requirement beyond the basics. To most it was a footnote, background noise in a show full of showstoppers. But to Eli it was a doorway. He'd never auditioned for anything before. Never stood in front of strangers and asked them to judge something so personal. Music wasn't performance for him, it was survival. It was the thing that kept the silence from swallowing him whole on nights when the apartment felt too empty, too quiet, too heavy with memories he was too young to carry. But this was different. This was a chance to be part of something real, something that happened out in the world, not just in the basement of his building where the piano sat, slightly out of tune, surrounded by stacked boxes and forgotten holiday decorations. The line inched forward. One by one, kids stepped into the center of the room, introduced themselves with practiced confidence, and launched into their pieces. Some singing 76 trombones with booming bravado, others tap dancing with sharp precision. Greaves sat at a folding table near the front, pen in hand, expression unreadable behind wire-rimmed glasses. He nodded occasionally, made quick marks on his clipboard, sometimes cut a performance short with a curt, "Thank you." He wasn't cruel exactly, just efficient. Time was money, and in community theater both were in short supply. When it was Eli's turn, he walked forward slowly, hands clasped in front of him like he was heading to confession. He stopped a few feet from Greaves's table and cleared his throat. "I'm here for the pianist position," he said, voice low but steady. Greaves looked up, eyes narrowing slightly as they took in the oversized blazer, the worn shoes, the lack of any professional-looking materials. "You play piano?" he asked, not unkindly, but with the kind of skepticism that comes from years of dealing with overeager parents and underprepared kids. "Yes, sir." "Do you have sheet music? A prepared piece?" Eli shook his head. "I don't need it. I can play from memory, or by ear." A few of the waiting kids exchanged glances. One stifled a laugh. Playing by ear? In a formal audition? That was like showing up to a math test with no calculator and saying you just feel the answers. Greaves leaned back in his chair, arms crossing over his chest. He'd heard it all before. The prodigies, the naturals, the kids who'd watched a few YouTube videos and thought that made them ready for live theater. He glanced at the clock on the wall. They were already behind schedule. "Look," he said, voice tinged with impatience, "this isn't a jam session. We need someone who can follow a score, hit cues on time, and not distract from the performance. If you can't read music, I'm not sure what you're doing here." Eli didn't flinch. "I can read music," he said quietly. "I just don't need to. Not for this." Greaves raised an eyebrow. "And what makes you so sure?" "I've listened to the whole score," Eli said. "Twice." I know where the transitions are, where the tempo shifts, where the actors need space. I can match it." There was a pause. The room felt suddenly still, as if everyone had stopped breathing to hear what came next. Greaves let out a short, dry laugh. He turned slightly toward the assistant stage manager standing nearby, as if sharing a private joke. Then, loud enough for the whole room to hear, he said, "If he plays the piano, I'll kneel right here." The words hung in the air like smoke. A few nervous giggles broke out. Someone muttered, "Ouch." The assistant stage manager looked down at her clipboard, suddenly very interested in a paperclip. But Eli didn't react with anger or embarrassment. He simply nodded, as if Greaves had just confirmed something he already knew. Without another word, he turned and walked toward the piano in the corner. The instrument hadn't been tuned in months, maybe years. The bench creaked as he sat down. He adjusted it slightly, then placed his hands over the keys, fingers hovering just above the ivory. For a long moment, he didn't move. The room waited, unsure whether this was part of the act or if he'd frozen. Then softly, he began to play. It wasn't 76 trombones. It wasn't even from the Music Man. It was something else entirely, something raw and wordless, a melody that seemed to rise from somewhere deep inside him. The notes were simple at first, just a few repeating phrases like a question asked over and over. But then they grew, weaving together in unexpected ways, building into something that felt both ancient and brand new. There was sorrow in it, yes, but also resilience. A kind of quiet joy that refused to be drowned out. The kids stopped fidgeting. The parents stopped whispering. Even Greaves, still seated at his table, found himself leaning forward, elbows on his knees, pen forgotten in his hand. Eli wasn't showing off. He wasn't trying to prove anything. He was just telling the truth. And the truth in that moment sounded like a piano played by someone who'd learned to speak through keys, because words had failed him too many times. As the music filled the room, something shifted. The audition stopped being a test and became something else, a shared moment, fragile and fleeting. You could see it in the way one girl wiped her eyes without realizing it, or how the stagehand by the door stood perfectly still, toolbox dangling from his hand. Even the dust motes in the sunbeams seemed to slow their dance. When the last note faded into silence, no one clapped. No one knew what to do. Applause felt too loud, too final for something that had just begun to unfold. Eli lowered his hands to his lap and looked up. Not at Greaves, not at the audience, but at the piano itself. As if thanking it, Greaves didn't say anything for a long time. He just sat there staring at the boy, his usual sharp edges softened by something he couldn't quite name. Finally, he cleared his throat. What was that?" he asked, voice quieter now. Eli shrugged. "Something I made up. You've never played it for anyone before?" "No." Greaves exhaled slowly, running a hand over his face. He glanced around the room, as if checking whether anyone else had witnessed what he just had. They had. Their faces said it all. "Well," he said finally, standing up, "I suppose we'll be needing a pianist after all." He didn't kneel, not then. But something in the way he looked at Eli, the way his voice had lost its edge, the way his shoulders had dropped just a fraction, told everyone in the room that the real audition had only just begun. And the boy in the hand-me-down blazer who'd walked in unnoticed had just changed everything without saying a word. The silence after the last note wasn't empty, it was full. Full of breath held too long, of thoughts too big for words, of something shifting deep in the room that no one could quite name. No one moved. No one spoke. Even the usual creaks of the old theater seemed to pause out of respect. Eli sat still at the piano, hands resting gently in his lap, eyes fixed on the middle C key like it held an answer he hadn't asked for yet. He hadn't planned to play that piece. He hadn't planned to play anything at all, really. He'd just known in that moment that if he didn't let the music out, it might never find its way into the world, and maybe, just maybe, someone needed to hear it. Martin Greaves stood slowly, the folding chair scraping softly against the floor. He didn't look at his clipboard. He didn't check his watch. For the first time all day, he wasn't thinking about schedules or budgets or whether the lighting rig would hold. He was thinking about sound, about how something so simple could carve a space inside a person and leave it changed. He walked toward the piano, not with his usual brisk stride, but with the careful steps of someone entering a sacred place. "That was yours?" he asked, voice lower now, almost gentle. Eli nodded. Yeah. You made it up just now? No, Eli said. I've played it before, just not in front of people. Greaves studied him, the quiet certainty in his eyes, the way his fingers still twitched slightly, as if they missed the keys already. Do you have a name for it? Eli hesitated. Not really. Sometimes I call it basement light. Basement light? Greaves repeated, tasting the words. There's a light in the basement of my building, Eli explained. It flickers, but it never goes out. Even when the power's off somewhere else, that one stays on. I don't know why. Maybe it's wired different, but it's always there. Greaves didn't say anything for a moment. He just looked at the boy, really looked at him, past the thrift store blazer, past the nervous energy of the audition, into the quiet strength that had just filled the room with something no script could capture. He thought about all the polished performers he'd seen that day, kids who'd rehearsed their pieces for weeks, who'd been coached by voice teachers and dance instructors, who knew exactly how to hit every note with textbook precision. And then there was this kid who hadn't even brought sheet music, who'd walked in like he was apologizing for taking up space, and who'd just played something that felt like it had been pulled straight from the soul. All right, Greaves said finally. You're in. A few kids in the back let out soft whoops. One of the parents clapped once, then stopped herself, unsure if it was appropriate. Eli just blinked as if he hadn't quite processed the words. For the show? He asked. For the show, Greaves confirmed. You'll be our offstage pianist. You'll need to learn the full score, of course. We'll give you the charts. Rehearsals start Monday. Can you be here by 6? Eli nodded quickly. Yes, absolutely. Good. Greaves turned to the assistant stage manager, add him to the call sheet, and get that piano tuned before Monday. It sounds like it's crying. As the room slowly came back to life, kids gathering their things, parents murmuring to each other, the stagehands resuming their work. Eli stayed seated for a few more seconds, running his fingers lightly over the keys without pressing down. He didn't feel triumphant. He didn't feel relieved. He just felt seen, not for his clothes or his background or what he lacked, but for what he could give. And that was enough. But the story didn't end there, because music like that doesn't just vanish when the room empties. It lingers. It echoes. Later that evening, as Greaves locked up the theater, he found himself walking past the piano one last time. He paused, hand on the door, and looked at it, the old battered instrument that had just spoken in a voice no one expected. He thought about the boy's hand, small but sure, moving over the keys like they'd been doing it forever. He thought about the name, Basement Light, and how strange it was that something so ordinary could hold so much meaning. He didn't know Eli's story yet. Not really, but he knew enough to understand that talent like that didn't come from nowhere. It came from somewhere quiet, somewhere overlooked, somewhere most people never thought to look. The next morning, Greaves arrived at the theater earlier than usual. The sun hadn't even fully risen, and the streets were still damp from overnight rain. He carried a thermos of coffee and a manila envelope. Inside the rehearsal room, everything was just as they'd left it. Chairs stacked, music stands folded. The piano sitting alone in the corner like a silent witness. Greaves walked over and placed the envelope on the bench. Inside was a handwritten note. You're hired. Rehearsals start Monday. And bring your own music. He didn't sign it. He didn't need to. He stood there for a moment looking at the piano, then turned and walked back out into the cool morning air. He didn't kneel, but in his own way he had. Meanwhile, across town, Eli was already awake. He hadn't slept much. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard the echo of those final chords, felt the weight of the silence that followed. His grandmother was in the kitchen, humming as she made oatmeal, the same tune she'd hummed every morning since he was little. She didn't ask how the audition went. She never did. She just trusted him to tell her when he was ready. When he finally came out of his room, she looked up from the stove and smiled. You look like you've been thinking hard. I played, he said simply. She nodded, stirring the pot. And? They said yes. She turned off the burner and walked over, placing a hand on his shoulder. I knew they would. How? Because, she said, her voice soft but sure, when you play, it's not just noise. It's truth. And people always hear truth, even if they don't know they're listening. That weekend, Eli went back to the basement of his building. The piano there was even more out of tune than the one at the theater. Its pedals sticky, its bench missing a leg. But it was his. He sat down and played Basement Light again. Slower this time, letting each note settle into the concrete walls, into the pipes overhead, into the quiet corners where loneliness usually lived. He played until his fingers ached, until the flickering light above him seemed to pulse in time with the music. He didn't know it yet, but someone was listening. Mrs. Calloway, the building superintendent, had been passing by on her way to fix a leaky faucet in 3B when she heard the first notes. She stopped in the hallway, toolbox in hand, and leaned against the wall. She'd heard Eli play before, of course, late at night, early in the morning, but never like this. Never with this kind of clarity, this kind of purpose. She closed her eyes and let the music wash over her, remembering her own son gone too soon, who used to whistle the same kind of melodies when he thought no one was listening. When Eli finished, she didn't applaud. She just knocked softly on the doorframe. "You're getting better," she said. He looked up, surprised. "You heard that?" "I hear everything in this building," she said with a wink. "But that was special. You gonna play it somewhere else?" "Yeah," he said. "At the theater." "Starting Monday." She nodded, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "Good. The world needs to hear that, Light. On Monday." Eli showed up at the theater exactly at 6, notebook in hand, wearing the same blazer. But this time, it was neatly pressed, the sleeves rolled just once at the cuffs. Greaves was already there, going over blocking notes with the choreographer. When he saw Eli, he gave a small nod. No fanfare, no big welcome. Just acknowledgement. "Piano's been tuned," he said. "Try it out." Eli sat down and played a few scales. The difference was night and day. The keys responded cleanly, the tone warm and clear. He smiled, just a little, and Greaves saw it. Rehearsal began. At first, Eli stayed in the wings, listening as the cast ran through You Got Trouble. He watched how the actors moved, how they paused for breath, how their energy shifted from line to line. He scribbled notes in his book, not about the music, but about the people. Harold, confident but stumbles on think. Marion, soft voice, needs space after Good Night, My Someone. By the second run-through, Greaves motioned for him to take the piano. "Just follow the tempo," he said. "Don't worry about perfection. Feel it," and Eli did. He didn't just play the notes, he played the room. When the mayor's wife flubbed her line and the cast broke into laughter, Eli slipped in a playful little trill that made everyone laugh harder. When Marion sang her solo with tears in her eyes, he softened the chords until they were barely there, like a whisper. Greaves watched from the back, arms crossed again, but this time it wasn't out of judgment. It was wonder. By the end of the night, the cast was buzzing. "Who is that kid?" someone asked during break. "He's like part of the scene, even though he's not on stage." Greaves just smiled and said, "He's our secret weapon." And so it went. Day after day, Eli showed up. He never complained about the late hours or the cold theater, or the fact that he wasn't getting paid. He just played. And with every rehearsal, the music grew, not louder but deeper. It became part of the heartbeat of the show. But the real magic wasn't just in the performance. It was in the way people began to change around him. The lead actor, who'd been tense and impatient, started staying late to talk with Eli about phrasing. The stage manager brought him hot chocolate on cold nights. Even the grumpy lighting tech, who rarely spoke to anyone, started nodding at him in the hallway. Because Eli didn't just play piano. He listened. And in a world that often shouted, that kind of quiet attention was rare. One evening, after everyone had left, Greaves found Eli still at the piano, practicing a transition between two scenes. He stood in the doorway for a long time, watching the boy's fingers move with a kind of grace that couldn't be taught. Finally, he walked in. "You know," he said, "most kids your age would be on their phones right now." Eli looked up. "I don't have one." Greaves raised an eyebrow. "No phone?" "Not really. My grandma's got one, but it's old. We share it." Greaves nodded slowly. "So, all this time you've just been here?" "Yeah," Eli said. "It's where I feel most like myself." Greaves didn't say anything for a moment. Then he pulled up a chair and sat down beside the piano. "Play it again," he said. "The one from the audition." Eli hesitated, then nodded. He placed his hands on the keys and began. And in that empty theater, under the soft glow of work lights, the basement light flickered to life once more. Not in a basement, but in the heart of a show, A director and a boy who never asked for anything except a chance to be heard. Most people only see the moment, the spotlight, the standing ovation, the stunned silence after the last note. They don't see the years before it. They don't see the nights when the only audience was a flickering bulb and the sound of rain tapping on a basement window. They don't see the hands that learned to speak because the voice had nothing left to say. Eli didn't grow up with piano lessons or recitals or parents who clapped proudly from the front row. He grew up in a 3-room apartment on the 3rd floor of a building that had seen better days, where the hallway lights buzzed like angry bees and the elevator hadn't worked in years. His grandmother worked double shifts at a laundry downtown, her fingers raw from detergent and hot water, her back bent from years of folding other people's clothes. She never complained. She just came home, made soup, and asked how his day was, even on the days when he didn't answer. His father was a name on a faded photograph tucked in a drawer, a man who'd left before Eli could walk, leaving behind only a pair of worn work boots and a silence that never quite faded. His mother, well, that was harder. She'd loved him in her way, but love wasn't always enough to outrun the storms inside a person. She'd tried, oh how she'd tried, but the world had been too loud, too sharp, too much. When Eli was 6, she didn't come home one night. The police came instead. They spoke in low voices in the kitchen while he sat on the couch, clutching a stuffed rabbit with one ear missing. After that, it was just him and his grandmother. The building they lived in had a basement, damp, dim, and mostly used for storage. Boxes of old holiday decorations, broken chairs, a rusted washing machine that hadn't spun in a decade. And in the far corner, beneath a dusty tarp, sat an upright piano. No one knew how it got there. Maybe a tenant left it behind. Maybe someone thought it would be worth fixing someday. But over time, it became part of the scenery. Another forgotten thing in a building full of them. Until Eli found it. He was 8, the first time he wandered down there, chasing a runaway ball. He pulled back the tarp out of curiosity, sneezed at the dust, and pressed a key. It groaned, out of tune, but it made a sound. He pressed another, then another. Soon he was sitting on the floor, legs stretched out, hitting random notes like he was trying to crack a code. There was no teacher, no instruction manual, just him, the keys, and the quiet hum of the furnace in the background. At first it was just noise, but slowly patterns emerged. He noticed that certain notes together made him feel calm. Others made his chest tighten like he was remembering something he couldn't name. He started listening not just to the piano but to everything. The rhythm of footsteps on the stairs, the melody of rain on the fire escape, the way his grandmother hummed while she cooked, always the same 3 notes over and over. Like a lullaby she didn't know she was singing one day. A neighbor gave him an old tablet, cracked screen, slow processor, but it still worked. He found videos online. Chopin, Beethoven, Nina Simone, Thelonious Monk. He watched them over and over, pausing, rewinding, mimicking the hand movements on the basement piano. He didn't understand music theory, but he understood feeling. And feeling, he learned, was its own kind of language. He never told anyone. Not because he was ashamed, but because it felt too private, like sharing a dream while you're still in it. The basement became his sanctuary. After school, he'd slip downstairs, tarp pulled back, and play for hours. Sometimes he made up songs. Sometimes he tried to copy what he'd heard. Sometimes he just let his hands wander, seeing where they'd go. Neighbors complained, of course. That noise again, someone would mutter in the hallway. Can't he do that somewhere else? But Mrs. Calloway, the building's superintendent, a woman with silver hair, thick glasses, and a laugh that sounded like gravel rolling down a hill, always defended him. That boy's got angels in his fingers, she'd say, arms crossed, standing firm in the hallway like a general protecting her troops. You ever hear something that made you feel less alone? That's what he's doing down there. She started leaving snacks by the basement door, packets of crackers, apples, once even a thermos of hot chocolate in the winter. She never said a word, just left them there like an offering to a quiet God. As the years passed, Eli's playing grew. Not flashy, not loud, but deep. He learned to listen to the silence between the notes, to the way a chord could hang in the air like a question. He played when he was happy. He played when he was sad. He played when the world felt too heavy to carry alone. But he never played for anyone. Not really, until the day he saw the flyer at the library. It was taped to a bulletin board between notices for lost cats and free ESL classes. Seeking pianist for offstage accompaniment. Must read music, improvise, and commit to full rehearsal schedule. He read it 3 times. His heart pounded. It felt like a door had cracked open, just a sliver, but enough to let in a sliver of light. He didn't tell his grandmother right away. He waited until dinner, stirring his soup slowly, watching the steam rise. "I saw something today," he said finally. She looked up from her plate. "Oh, we're at the library. They need a pianist. For a show." She didn't ask if he was good enough. She didn't ask if he'd be paid. She just set down her spoon and said, "You should go. But what if I'm not? Ready?" She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. Her skin was rough, her knuckles swollen from work, but her touch was gentle. "Ready isn't something you wait for," she said. "It's something you become by doing." So he went. And when he sat down at that piano in the audition room, he wasn't thinking about impressing anyone. He wasn't thinking about getting the job. He was thinking about the basement light, the one that flickered but never went out. He was thinking about all the nights he'd played to empty walls, hoping, without even knowing it, that someday someone would hear him. And someone did. Now, as rehearsals continued, word began to spread. Not in a loud way, no headlines, no viral videos, but in the quiet way that real things grow. A stagehand mentioned it to his cousin, who told her music teacher. The teacher mentioned it to a retired concert pianist who volunteered at the community center. That pianist, a woman with silver hair and eyes that had seen decades of prodigies come and go, asked if she could sit in on a rehearsal. She came on a Thursday night, wrapped in a wool coat despite the warm weather, carrying a small leather satchel. She sat in the back, silent, watching as the cast ran through Till There Was You. When Eli played the interlude, a simple, tender passage that mirrored the longing in the lyrics, she didn't move. But her eyes filled with tears. After rehearsal, she walked up to him. "May I?" she asked, nodding toward the piano. He stepped aside. She sat, adjusted the bench, and played a few scales. Her fingers were older, slower, but still precise, like they remembered every note they'd ever touched. Then she turned to him. "You have a rare gift," she said, "not just technique. That can be taught. But this," she tapped her chest, "this comes from living." Eli didn't know what to say. "I just play what I feel." "That's the hardest thing to do," she said. "And the most important." She left him her card. "If you ever want lessons," she said, "my door is open. No charge." He tucked the card into his notebook, next to his grocery list and his grandmother's doctor appointment reminder. Back at the apartment that night, he told his grandmother about the woman. She listened quietly, peeling potatoes at the sink. "You're not going to stop playing for us, are you?" she asked, half joking. "Never," he said. "This place, it's where it started," she smiled. "Good. Because the basement light misses you when you're gone too long." He went down the next morning. The piano was exactly as he'd left it, dusty, slightly out of tune, one key sticking. He played Basement Light again, but this time it sounded different, fuller, like it had grown while he was away. He didn't know it yet, but his story was no longer just his. It was becoming part of something bigger, a thread in a tapestry woven from quiet acts of courage, unexpected kindness, and the stubborn belief that beauty can bloom even in the most forgotten corners. And all of it began with a boy who chose to press a key when the world told him to stay silent. The morning after that first full run-through, something shifted in the air around the theater, not in a dramatic way, not with fanfare or headlines, but in the quiet, steady way that real change often arrives. People started showing up early just to hear Eli warm up. The cast stopped rushing through transitions, listening instead for the subtle cues he wove into the music. Even the grumpy old stagehand who'd once muttered about kids these days was now the first to shush anyone who talked during Eli's solos. It wasn't fame, not the kind that comes with flashing cameras or social media likes, but something deeper, something that felt like respect earned note by note. Then came the flyer. Someone, no one ever admitted who, snapped a photo during rehearsal. Eli at the piano, head slightly bowed, fingers hovering over the keys, sunlight catching the dust in the air around him like he was wrapped in gold. Beneath it, someone typed a short caption. He walked in with nothing but a notebook. Now the whole show breathes because of him. It was posted on the theater's community board, then shared on a local arts page, then picked up by a small neighborhood newsletter. Within a week, tickets for The Music Man, a show that usually struggled to fill half the seats, were selling out. People weren't coming just for Harold Hill or Marion the librarian. They were coming for the boy who played the piano off stage, the one whose music seemed to stitch the whole production together like invisible thread. Martin Greaves noticed it first in the box office reports. Then in the whispers in the lobby. Is he really only 13? Did you hear he taught himself? They say he plays like he's got 100 years of sadness in his fingers. He didn't encourage the talk. He never posted about Eli online or gave interviews. But he didn't stop it either, because deep down he knew this wasn't about hype. It was about truth, and truth, once spoken, has a way of finding ears that need to hear it. One afternoon, a man in a well-tailored coat showed up at the stage door, holding a brochure for a youth conservatory 2 states away. He introduced himself as a program coordinator and said he'd heard about Eli through a mutual friend in the music community. He asked if he could sit in on a rehearsal. Greaves hesitated. He didn't like outsiders poking around, but something in the man's eyes told him this wasn't a scout looking for the next viral sensation. This was someone who recognized a spark and wanted to protect it. He said yes. The man sat through the entire run, silent, notebook in hand. Afterward, he approached Eli not with grand promises, but with a simple question. Do you ever think about studying music formally? Eli shrugged. I don't know. I just play. That's the best place to start, the man said. But you've got something rare. It deserves room to grow. He left behind a brochure and a handwritten note with his direct number. No pressure, he said. Just know the door's open. That same week, a local nonprofit that supported arts education reached out to the theater. They'd heard the stories. They wanted to help. Not with publicity or press releases, but with something real. A week later, a delivery truck pulled up to Eli's building. 2 men carried a polished upright piano up the 3 flights of stairs. No elevator. Remember, and placed it gently in the living room, right by the window where the afternoon light poured in. Eli stood in the doorway, stunned. This is for me? For you and your grandmother, the driver said, handing him a card. From the Cleveland Youth Arts Initiative. They said you've earned it, his grandmother cried. Not the loud, messy kind, but the quiet tears that come when hope finally catches up to you after years of walking alone. That night, Eli played the new piano for the first time. The sound was richer, clearer, more alive than anything he'd ever touched. He played Basement Light again, but this time it didn't sound like a memory. It sounded like a promise. Still, through all the changes, Eli stayed the same. He still took the bus to rehearsals. He still helped his grandmother carry groceries up the stairs. He still wore the same blazer, now neatly pressed but still secondhand because it reminded him of who he was before anyone noticed. Fame didn't cling to him. It brushed past like a breeze, and he let it go. But the world kept reaching out. A retired piano technician, who'd read about him in the local paper, started coming by the apartment every other Saturday to tune the new piano for free. Consider it my donation to the future, he'd say, wiping his hands on a cloth. A high school music teacher invited him to play at a student recital, not as a guest star but as a peer. Just sit in with the jazz ensemble, she said. Let them hear what listening really sounds like. Even Mrs. Calloway got in on it. She started leaving little notes in his mailbox. Played your song while fixing Mrs. Ruiz's sink, she cried. You're healing this building, kid. And through it all, Greaves watched, not with pride exactly, but with a quiet awe that grew deeper each day. He'd spent years chasing perfection in theater, crisp diction, precise blocking, flawless timing. But Eli had shown him something he'd forgotten, that art isn't about perfection. It's about connection. And sometimes the most powerful moments happen off stage, in the spaces between the lines, in the silence after a note fades. Opening night arrived faster than anyone expected. The theater buzzed with energy, ushers in crisp vests, programs freshly printed, flowers on the stage manager's desk. Backstage, the cast paced, adjusted costumes, whispered good lucks. But in the wings near the piano, Eli sat calmly, running his fingers over the keys without making a sound. He wasn't nervous. He was ready. Greaves found him there 10 minutes before curtain. He didn't say much. just stood beside him for a moment, watching the way the stage lights reflected in the polished wood of the piano. "You've changed this place," he said quietly. Eli looked up. "I just played." "You did more than that," Greaves said. "You reminded us why we do this. Not for applause, not for reviews, but because sometimes music is the only thing that makes sense." The show began. The audience laughed at Harold Hill's schemes, sighed at Marion's quiet strength, tapped their feet to the barbershop quartet. But when the scene shifted to the library, and the lights dimmed just slightly, and Eli's solo interlude began, a new piece, softer than basement light, woven with threads of hope and hesitation, the room fell into a silence so deep you could hear the hum of the air vents. He played like he was telling a story only he knew the ending to. And for 3 minutes, 217 people in that theater forgot they were watching a show. They were just listening, to a boy, to a piano, to the sound of something real. When the final chord hung in the air and faded, there was a beat, just one, of pure stillness. Then the applause came, not loud at first, but building, wave after wave, until it filled every corner of the room. Backstage, Greaves didn't cheer. He just closed his eyes and exhaled like he'd been holding his breath for weeks. After the final bow, when the cast had cleared the stage and the lights were dimming, Greaves found Eli in the wings, carefully stacking his sheet music. He didn't say "great job." He didn't say "you were amazing." He just placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, light but firm, and murmured, "You've got a gift." "Don't waste it," Eli nodded. "I won't," and he meant it. In the weeks that followed, life didn't explode into stardom. There were no record deals, no national tours, no interviews on morning TV. But something quieter, more lasting, began to take root. The conservatory sent another letter, this time with an acceptance form and a full scholarship offer. The nonprofit asked if he'd be willing to mentor younger kids in the neighborhood. His grandmother started getting calls from other parents. "Can your grandson teach my child?" "Just a little? He makes it sound like magic." He said yes to all of it, not because he wanted to be famous, but because he remembered what it felt like to sit alone in a basement, wondering if anyone would ever hear him. One evening, long after rehearsals had ended and the theater was empty, Greaves returned to lock up. He passed the piano and paused. On the bench sat a single sheet of music, handwritten, no title, just a series of notes that flowed like a river. At the bottom, in small, careful letters, it read, "For the man who almost didn't listen." He sat down and played it slowly, his stiff fingers stumbling over the keys. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest, and in that empty theater, under the glow of a single work light, Martin Greaves, director skeptic, once so sure of what talent looked like, finally knelt. Not on the floor, but in his heart, because sometimes the most powerful moments aren't the ones that bring you to your knees. They're the ones that lift you up, quietly, gently, one note at a time. The story didn't end with a trophy. It didn't end with a spotlight or a standing ovation that lasted for minutes. It ended, as most real stories do, with a quiet morning, a packed bag, and the kind of hope that doesn't shout, but settles deep in your bones like a steady rhythm you can count on. Weeks after opening night, life in the theater returned to its usual pace. The sets were struck, the costumes laundered and stored, the programs recycled. The buzz around Eli faded from headlines back into the gentle hum of everyday life. But something had changed, not just in him, but in everyone who'd heard him play. You could see it in the way the stagehands lingered near the piano during load-in, or how the lighting designer started humming melodies while adjusting cues. Music had seeped into the walls, into the floorboards, into the very air of the place, and it stayed. For Eli, the biggest change came in the form of a thick envelope with a university seal. Inside was an acceptance letter to a prestigious youth conservatory, full scholarship, room and board included, starting that fall. His grandmother held the letter in her hands for a long time, her eyes tracing every word like she was memorizing it. Then she looked up, tears glistening but smile steady. "You're going," she said. "Not a question, a fact." "I don't have to," Eli replied quickly. "I can stay, keep playing here, help out at the community center." She shook her head. "This isn't about staying," she said gently. "It's about growing. You don't honor a gift by hiding it. You honor it by letting it stretch its wings." He knew she was right, but that didn't make it easier. The thought of leaving the building, The basement, the flickering light. The neighbors who'd become like family felt like stepping off solid ground into open air. Still, he packed his things, his notebook filled with scribbled melodies, the blazer, now neatly folded at the bottom of his suitcase, a small framed photo of him and his grandmother from last Christmas, and the handwritten sheet music Greaves had found on the piano bench, now carefully preserved in a plastic sleeve. The night before he left, Mrs. Calloway knocked on their door with a pie, apple his favorite, and a small wooden box. "For your new room," she said, handing it to him. Inside was a tiny brass lamp shaped like an old-fashioned streetlight, so you never forget where your light started. He hugged her tight, the kind of hug that says more than words ever could. The next morning, Greaves showed up at the bus stop, not the fancy train station or the airport, but the local bus that would take Eli to the city's main transit hub. He didn't say much, just handed him a worn leather music bag he'd had since his own college days. "It's seen better days," he said, "but it holds everything that matters." Eli slung it over his shoulder. It smelled faintly of rosin and old paper, like history, like possibility. They stood in silence for a while, watching the city wake up. Cars passed. A delivery truck rumbled down the street. Somewhere a dog barked. "You'll come back?" Greaves finally asked. "Of course," Eli said. "This place, it's part of my music." Greaves nodded. "Good, because we'll be listening." When the bus arrived, Eli climbed on, found a window seat, and placed his bag in the overhead rack. As the doors closed and the engine rumbled to life, he looked out and saw them, his grandmother waving from the sidewalk, Mrs. Calloway standing beside her with her hands on her hips like a sentinel, and Greaves a few steps behind, arms crossed but eyes soft. No grand speeches, no tears. Just three people who'd believed in a quiet boy with a notebook and a dream, watching him go. The bus pulled away, and Eli didn't look back, not because he didn't care, but because he knew he'd carry them with him, in every note he'd ever play. At the conservatory, everything was different. The pianos were grand, shiny, perfectly tuned, worth more than his entire apartment building. The students wore crisp shirts and talked about composers like they were old friends. The halls echoed with scales and etudes, with the kind of precision that came from years of formal training. At first, Eli felt like an imposter. He didn't know all the terms. He couldn't sight-read complex scores on the first try. He still played mostly by feel, but then came the first ensemble rehearsal. The instructor asked each student to share a short piece, something personal, not from the standard repertoire. One by one, they played polished sonatas, intricate fugues, technically flawless but emotionally distant. When it was Eli's turn, he hesitated. Then he sat down and played Basement Light. He didn't announce it, didn't explain, just let the music speak. When he finished, the room was silent. Not the polite silence of obligation, but the deep, breathless kind that comes when something true has been said. After a moment, an older student, a cellist from New York, stood up and said, "Can I play with you next time? That melody, it needs a cello underneath it." And just like that, he belonged. He didn't become the star of the conservatory. He didn't win every competition or land a recording contract by semester's end. But he learned. He grew. He discovered new ways to say the things he'd always felt. And slowly his music began to change, not because he lost his roots, but because he let them reach deeper. During breaks, he'd call his grandmother. She'd tell him about Mrs. Ruiz's new grandbaby, about the leak in 2B finally getting fixed, about how the neighbors still gathered in the hallway sometimes, just to listen when she played the new piano. "They say it sounds like you're still here," she'd say, and he'd smile. He also started writing again, not just melodies, but letters, to Greaves, to Mrs. Calloway, even to the retired pianist who'd given him his first real lesson. He told them about his classes, his struggles, the way the autumn leaves sounded when they fell on the conservatory courtyard, and in return, they sent stories of their own, about the theater's new production, about a stray cat Mrs. Calloway had adopted, about how Greaves had started including a short piano prelude before every show now, just to set the mood, One winter break, he returned home. Not as a prodigy, not as a celebrity, but as himself. He played at the community center, not on a grand piano, but on the same upright from his living room, now moved to the main hall. Kids sat cross-legged on the floor. Parents stood in the back, arms folded, smiling. His grandmother sat in the front row, hands folded in her lap, eyes closed, listening like she was hearing it for the first time. Afterward, a little girl tugged on his sleeve. "Can you teach me to play like that?" she asked. He knelt down. "You don't play like me," he said gently. "You play like you. But I can help you find your sound." And so he did. Years later, long after he'd graduated, performed in small concert halls, and even composed music for local theater productions, he returned to the Cleveland Playhouse not as a hired pianist but as a guest artist. The building had been renovated, the seats replaced, the lighting upgraded, but the piano in the corner, it was the same one from his audition. Greaves had refused to let them replace it. On opening night of the new season, Eli played a short prelude before the curtain rose, a new piece woven with echoes of basement light, but brighter now like dawn after a long night. In the front row sat his grandmother, hair whiter, back more bent but eyes just as sharp. Beside her, Mrs. Calloway, now retired but still sharp-tongued and warm-hearted. And in the wings, arms crossed as always, stood Greaves, older, slower, but still listening. After the show, they all gathered in the green room, sharing coffee and stories. No one mentioned fame or success. They talked about the weather, the new bus route, how the basement light in Eli's old building had finally been replaced, with a brighter, steadier bulb, but one that still flickered sometimes just for old time's sake. As the night wound down and people began to leave, Eli walked back to the piano one last time. He didn't play, just ran his fingers over the keys, feeling the familiar grooves, the slight stick in the G-sharp, the warmth of wood that had held so many unspoken things. He thought about the boy who'd walked in here years ago, scared and unsure, wearing a blazer 2 sizes too big. He thought about the silence that followed his first notes, the scoff that turned to awe, the journey that began not with a bang, but with a single key pressed in faith. He didn't need a trophy. He didn't need a headline. He had something better, a life shaped by music, by people who saw him when he felt invisible, by a gift that had grown not in spite of his past, but because of it. And as he stepped out, into the cool evening air, the city lights blinking like distant stars, he knew one thing for certain. Wherever he went, whatever he played, he would always carry that basement light with him, not as a memory, but as a compass. Because sometimes the most powerful stories aren't the ones that end with applause. They're the ones that keep playing softly in the hearts of those who needed to hear them most.